In a small, quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, two police officers pulled up to an old house with peeling white paint and a crooked wooden fence. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cracked driveway. Officer Daniels, a young man in his late 20s with a buzz cut and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his leg, glanced at his partner, Officer Reynolds. Reynolds, older and more seasoned, adjusted his hat as he stepped out of the car. They had been sent here on what seemed like a routine mission: serve an eviction notice to an elderly woman who hadn't paid her property taxes for several years. It wasn't the kind of job either of them enjoyed. They knew how emotionally charged these situations could get, but it was part of their duties. As they approached the porch, the creaking sound of each step echoed through the stillness of the evening. The house looked tired, almost as if it were holding on to its last breaths. Weeds sprouted between the cracks in the sidewalk, and the once vibrant flower beds were now overgrown with wild grass. Despite its worn appearance, there was something oddly dignified about the place. A faint scent of lavender drifted through the air, mixing with the earthy smell of damp soil after a recent rainstorm. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked in the distance, but otherwise the street was eerily silent. Officer Reynolds knocked firmly on the door, 3 deliberate raps that echoed into the house. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door opened just wide enough for a face to peer out. An elderly black woman stood before them, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. Her silver hair was neatly tied back in a bun, and her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence despite the lines etched into her weathered skin. She wore a simple floral dress, and though she appeared frail, her presence commanded respect. "Good evening," she said in a calm, steady voice. "Can I help you?" Reynolds cleared his throat, suddenly feeling uneasy. He held up the envelope containing the eviction notice. "Ma'am, we're here regarding your property taxes. There's been some unpaid dues, and unfortunately—" "I see," the woman interrupted gently, nodding as though she'd expected this visit. "Please come inside." She stepped aside, allowing the officers to enter. The interior of the house was modest, but impeccably clean. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, illuminating stacks of books piled neatly along the walls. Faded photographs hung on the walls, capturing moments frozen in time. In one corner of the living room sat a rocking chair draped with a handmade quilt, its colors faded but still vibrant enough to tell stories of days gone by. Daniels hesitated, glancing around the room. Something about this place felt different from other homes they'd visited during evictions. There was no sense of chaos or neglect here, no signs of someone struggling to keep up with life's demands. Instead, everything seemed purposeful, as if every item had been placed exactly where it belonged. "I'm Evelyn Carter," the woman introduced herself, gesturing toward the couch. "Have a seat, please." Her tone was polite yet firm, leaving little room for refusal. The officers exchanged uncertain looks but obliged, sitting stiffly on the edge of the cushions. Reynolds cleared his throat again, trying to regain his composure. "Mrs. Carter, as I mentioned earlier, we're here because of outstanding property taxes. If these aren't resolved soon, the county will be forced to take action." Mrs. Carter nodded thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. "I understand," she said simply. "But may I ask you to wait just a moment? I'd like to retrieve some documents that might clarify things." Without waiting for a response, she turned and disappeared down a narrow hallway. Left alone in the living room, Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His gaze wandered to the photographs hanging on the wall. One particular picture caught his eye. A younger version of Mrs. Carter dressed in judicial robes, standing confidently beside a group of lawyers. He leaned closer, squinting at the image. "Hey, look at this," he whispered to Reynolds, pointing at the photo. "Doesn't she look kinda official?" Reynolds shrugged, unimpressed. "Probably just someone she knows," he muttered dismissively, but deep down, even he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. A few minutes later, Mrs. Carter returned carrying a thick folder. She settled back into her chair, placing the folder on the coffee table between them. With deliberate care, she began flipping through the pages, revealing legal documents, handwritten notes, and official stamps. The officers watched silently, their curiosity growing with each passing second. "You see," Mrs. Carter began, her voice steady and measured, "I've been aware of these claims against my property for quite some time now. However, let me show you something." She paused, pulling out a single sheet of paper and sliding it across the table toward them. It took a moment for the words to register. When they finally did, both officers froze, their faces pale with shock. The document bore the signature of Judge Evelyn Carter, none other than the woman sitting across from them. This can't be right," Reynolds stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're saying you're the judge who handled your own case?" Mrs. Carter smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and wisdom. "Not exactly," she replied. "But yes, I am a retired judge, and yes, I successfully appealed this matter months ago. Unfortunately, it seems the court failed to update its records accordingly. The weight of their mistake hit them like a ton of bricks. Here they were, ready to evict a former judge, a woman who had dedicated her life to upholding justice, because of a clerical error. The irony of the situation was almost too much to bear. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of an old clock mounted on the wall. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. This is all our fault." Mrs. Carter studied them closely, her expression softening. "There's no need to apologize," she said kindly. "Mistakes happen, even in systems designed to prevent them. What matters is what you do next." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Both officers felt a strange mix of shame and admiration. They had entered this house expecting to enforce an order, but instead, they found themselves learning a lesson they would never forget. As the gravity of their mistake settled over them, Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The room felt smaller somehow, the weight of Mrs. Carter's presence pressing down on him. He glanced at the document again, her name signed, boldly beneath the official seal, Judge Evelyn Carter. It was surreal to think that this soft-spoken elderly woman had once presided over courtrooms, making decisions that shaped lives. Mrs. Carter leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting gently on the armrests. She didn't seem angry or upset, just calm and composed, as though she'd expected something like this might happen eventually. "Let me explain what happened," she said, her voice steady but warm. "When I received notice about the unpaid taxes, I reviewed the case thoroughly. Turns out there was a clerical error, a miscalculation in the amount owed, and I filed an appeal immediately." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "The appeal went through without issue. The court acknowledged the mistake and dismissed the claim against my property. However," her tone softened, almost apologetic now, "someone along the line failed to update the records properly. That's why you're here today, with outdated paperwork." Officer Reynolds rubbed the back of his neck, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Ma'am, I don't know how to even begin apologizing for this. We should have checked more carefully before coming here. This is unacceptable." Mrs. Carter gave him a small, reassuring smile. "It's not your fault entirely," she said. "You were following orders based on information provided to you. But it does highlight a bigger problem, one that affects many people, especially those who don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back." Her words struck a chord with both officers. Daniels thought about all the eviction notices they'd served in the past, the faces of families pleading for more time, the desperation in their voices. How many of those cases might have been rooted in similar errors? He realized then that he'd never stopped to question the validity of the documents handed to him. His job had always been to enforce the law, not to scrutinize it. Reynolds, meanwhile, couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. As a veteran officer, he prided himself on being thorough and detail-oriented. Yet here he was, caught off guard, by a simple oversight. "We'll fix this right away," he promised, straightening up in his seat. "I'll personally make sure the records are corrected and we'll pull your file from circulation immediately." Mrs. Carter nodded appreciatively. "Thank you," she said simply. "But let me ask you something. Do you know why mistakes like this happen so often?" The officers exchanged uncertain glances. "Well, I guess it could be carelessness?" Daniels ventured hesitantly. "It's more than that," Mrs. Carter replied. "It's systemic. People assume that because someone is elderly, or poor, or part of a marginalized community, they won't challenge the system. They assume these individuals won't push back when things go wrong. And sometimes they're right. Not everyone has access to legal representation or the energy to fight bureaucratic red tape." Her gaze lingered on them, piercing yet kind. "Even I, a former judge, wasn't immune to this oversight. Imagine how much harder it must be for others who don't have my background or experience." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Both officers felt a mix of emotions: shame, frustration, and a growing sense of responsibility. For years they'd seen their roles as enforcers of the law, carrying out orders without questioning the bigger picture. But now, sitting across from Mrs. Carter, they began to see themselves differently, as participants in a system that wasn't always fair or just. After a moment, Mrs. Carter broke the silence. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, surprising them both. Her tone was casual, almost as if she were inviting old friends to stay a while longer. Despite everything, there was no trace of bitterness in her demeanor. Instead, she radiated grace and understanding. Daniels blinked, unsure how to respond. Yes, ma'am. Thank you," he stammered awkwardly. Reynolds nodded in agreement, still struggling to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Mrs. Carter rose slowly from her chair, using her cane for support, and disappeared into the kitchen. While she was gone, the officers took the opportunity to look around the room again. Daniels noticed a stack of books on the side table, their spines cracked from years of use. Titles like To Kill a Mockingbird and The New Jim Crow stood out among the collection. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat a framed photograph of Mrs. Carter standing beside a group of young students, her expression radiant with pride. "This place has character," Reynolds murmured, running a hand over the smooth surface of the coffee table. "Feels like every piece of furniture has a story. And every book probably has a lesson," Daniels added, pointing toward the shelves lining the walls. "She seems wise, like she's lived through a lot." Before Reynolds could reply, Mrs. Carter returned, balancing a tray with 3 steaming cups of chamomile tea. She set the tray down on the table and handed each officer a cup. "Careful, it's hot," she warned with a gentle smile. They thanked her and sipped cautiously, the warmth of the tea spreading through their bodies. For a few moments, no one spoke. The quiet hum of the house filled the space, punctuated only by the occasional creak of wooden floorboards. Finally, Mrs. Carter broke the silence. "Tell me about yourselves," she said, leaning forward slightly. "What made you choose this line of work?" Daniels, nearly choked on his tea, caught off guard by the question. Well," he started hesitantly. "I guess I wanted to help people. You know, make a difference in the community." Reynolds chimed in, his tone more confident. "Same here. Growing up, I saw how hard it was for folks in my neighborhood to get by. I figured becoming a cop would give me a chance to protect people and keep them safe." Mrs. Carter nodded thoughtfully, her eyes twinkling with interest. "That's admirable," she said. "But tell me, how do you define justice?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Daniel stared into his teacup, searching for the right words. "Justice? I guess it means doing what's fair, making sure everyone follows the rules. And what happens when the rules themselves aren't fair?" Mrs. Carter pressed gently. "What happens when the system fails the very people it's supposed to protect?" Reynolds frowned, considering her words. "Then it's our job to speak up," he said after a pause, "to point out the flaws and try to fix them. Mrs. Carter smiled approvingly. Exactly. Justice isn't blind. It sees clearly when we choose to look. It's not enough to follow orders blindly. Sometimes, you have to question whether those orders align with what's truly right. Her words resonated deeply with both men, planting seeds of reflection that would grow long after they left her home. For the first time, they began to see their roles not just as enforcers of the law, but as guardians of fairness and integrity. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Carter shared stories from her own career as a judge. She spoke of difficult cases, moral dilemmas, and the importance of empathy in every decision. Her anecdotes painted a vivid picture of a life dedicated to service, inspiring the officers to rethink their approach to their own work. By the time they finished their tea and prepared to leave, the initial tension had melted away, replaced by mutual respect and gratitude. Mrs. Carter walked them to the door, handing each of them a small card as they stepped onto the porch. On it was written a single quote: "Justice is not blind. It sees clearly when we choose to look." As they drove away, Daniels glanced at the card in his hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, he understood that true justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing people, hearing their stories, and fighting for what was right, even when it was hard. The drive back to the station was quieter than usual. Officer Daniels gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he replayed the evening's events in his mind. Beside him, Officer Reynolds stared out the passenger window, watching the blur of streetlights and shadows pass by. Neither man spoke for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "You know," he began hesitantly, glancing at Reynolds, "I've served a lot of eviction notices before. Never once did I stop to think about whether they were actually fair." Reynolds sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, me too. We just do our jobs, right? Show up, hand over the papers, and move on. But tonight felt different." Daniels nodded slowly. Mrs. Carter wasn't angry or defensive. She could have been. She had every right to be, but instead, she used the situation to teach us something. Like she saw it as an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Reynolds asked, turning to face his partner. "For us to see things differently," Daniels replied. "She made us realize that we're not just cogs in a machine. We have power. The power to question, to push back when something feels wrong. And honestly, that scares me a little." Reynolds chuckled dryly. "Scares me too. Makes you wonder. How many other cases like this slip through the cracks because no one bothers to double-check?" They lapsed into silence again, the weight of Mrs. Carter's words pressing down on them. When they finally arrived at the station, the fluorescent lights inside seemed harsh and unforgiving compared to the warmth of her home. The bustling activity around them, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, officers chatting, felt distant, almost surreal. Back at his desk, Reynolds pulled up Mrs. Carter's file on the computer. He scrolled through page after page of documents, searching for any trace of the error she'd mentioned. Sure enough, buried deep within the system was a note confirming that the case had been dismissed months ago. Someone along the line had failed to update the records, leaving the eviction notice active despite the resolution. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "How does something like this even happen?" Daniels, who had been standing nearby, shook his head. "It's not just one person's fault, it's the system. Everyone assumes someone else will catch the mistake, so nobody takes responsibility." "Well, we're taking responsibility now," Reynolds said firmly, standing up. "Let's fix this and make damn sure it doesn't happen again." Over the next hour, the two officers worked tirelessly to correct the oversight. They flagged Mrs. Carter's account, removed the eviction notice from circulation, and sent an urgent email to their superiors explaining the situation. By the time they finished, it was nearly midnight, but neither man complained. For the first time in a long while, they felt like they were doing more than just following orders. They were making a difference. The next morning, news of the incident spread quickly through the department. Some officers laughed it off, teasing Daniels. and Reynolds about trying to evict a retired judge. Others, however, were intrigued by the story. Word eventually reached Captain Harris, the head of their division, who called the two men into his office for a private meeting. Captain Harris was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He gestured for them to sit, leaning forward on his desk with an unreadable expression. "I heard about your little adventure last night," he said, his tone neutral. "Care to explain?" Reynolds cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, there was a clerical error regarding an eviction notice. We went to serve it without realizing the case had already been resolved. Turns out the homeowner was Judge Evelyn Carter, retired." Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Judge Carter? The same Judge Carter who presided over civil rights cases in the 80s? "That's correct, sir," Daniels chimed in. "She handled the situation with incredible grace. She didn't yell or accuse us of anything. Instead, she used the moment to highlight bigger issues, systemic failures, lack of accountability, and the disproportionate impact these mistakes can have on marginalized communities." Harris sat back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "And what did you take away from all this?" Reynolds exchanged a glance with Daniels before answering. "We learned that we can't just follow orders blindly. We need to question things, dig deeper, and make sure we're not contributing to injustice, even unintentionally." Harris nodded approvingly. "Good. That kind of awareness is exactly what this department needs more of. I want you to write up a report detailing everything that happened. Include recommendations for preventing similar oversights in the future." "Yes, sir," both officers replied in unison. As they left the office, Daniels turned to Reynolds with a small smile. "Think he'll actually listen to our suggestions?" Reynolds shrugged. "Only one way to find out. Let's make sure our report is thorough enough to get his attention." Over the next few weeks, Daniels and Reynolds poured their energy into drafting the report. They interviewed colleagues, reviewed past cases, and researched systemic errors in property tax disputes. Their findings revealed a troubling pattern. Low-income households and elderly individuals were disproportionately affected by administrative mistakes, often due to outdated systems and poor communication between departments. Armed with data and personal anecdotes, including their encounter with Mrs. Carter, they presented their report to Captain Harris. To their relief, he took it seriously, convening a meeting with senior staff to discuss potential solutions. Within days, new protocols were implemented to improve record-keeping and ensure better oversight of eviction notices. Word of the changes soon reached Mrs. Carter, who received a phone call from the current chief judge personally thanking her for bringing attention to the issue. Though she declined public recognition, she expressed gratitude for the steps being taken to address the problem. Meanwhile, Daniels and Reynolds found themselves transformed by the experience. They started paying closer attention to details, advocating for transparency in their work, and treating every individual they encountered with greater empathy. Even the teasing from their colleagues faded as others began to see the value of questioning assumptions and striving for fairness. One afternoon, while reviewing another eviction case, Daniels paused, staring at the screen. Something about the paperwork didn't add up. He flagged the file and brought it to Reynolds' attention. Together, they discovered yet another clerical error, one that would have displaced a young family if left unchecked. As they worked to resolve the issue, Reynolds couldn't help but smile. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this whole thing with Mrs. Carter really changed my perspective. Before, I just saw these cases as numbers on a page. Now I see the people behind them, the lives hanging in the balance." Daniels nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "Yeah. And it's not just about fixing mistakes anymore. It's about making sure we never stop looking for ways to improve. Justice isn't blind, it sees clearly when we choose to look." Reynolds grinned. "Sounds like something Mrs. Carter would say." "She'd probably approve of it," Daniels replied with a chuckle. Though they never saw Mrs. Carter again, her influence lingered in everything they did. Her wisdom, patience, and unwavering commitment to justice became guiding principles in their careers. And whenever they faced difficult decisions, they remembered her words, etched on the cards she'd given them. Justice is not blind. It sees clearly when we choose to look. Years later, when recounting the story to new recruits during training sessions, Daniels always ended with the same message. Sometimes the people we least expect can teach us the biggest lessons. All we have to do is listen. The weeks following their encounter with Mrs. Carter brought a noticeable shift in officers Daniels and Reynolds. What had started as a routine assignment turned into a turning point, not just for them personally, but also for the department they served. The report they submitted to Captain Harris wasn't just a formality. It became the foundation for meaningful change within the system. Captain Harris, impressed by the depth of their research and the passion behind their recommendations, decided to take action. He called a meeting with senior staff and department heads, laying out the findings from Daniels and Reynolds' report. The room buzzed with murmurs as he highlighted the systemic errors that had led to wrongful evictions, particularly those affecting vulnerable populations like the elderly and low-income families. This isn't just about one mistake, Harris emphasized, his voice firm. It's about fixing a broken process so no one else has to suffer because of our oversights. From there, a series of reforms began to take shape. New protocols were introduced to ensure eviction notices were double-checked against updated records before being issued. A task force was created to review pending cases flagged for potential discrepancies, and additional training sessions were scheduled to educate officers on how to identify red flags in legal documents. The department even partnered with local advocacy groups to provide resources for residents facing property tax disputes, ensuring they had access to legal aid if needed. Daniels and Reynolds played an active role in these efforts. They attended workshops, shared their story at training sessions, and worked closely with IT specialists to streamline the record-keeping system. At first, some colleagues dismissed their enthusiasm as overzealousness, but as results began to show, attitudes shifted. Slowly, others started adopting the same mindset, questioning assumptions, digging deeper, and prioritizing fairness above expediency. One afternoon, while reviewing a stack of files, Daniels came across another troubling case. It involved a single mother struggling to pay her property taxes after losing her job during the pandemic. Her home was slated for auction unless she could settle the outstanding balance within days. Something about the timeline didn't sit right with him. He flagged the file and brought it to Reynolds' attention. Together, they dug into the details, uncovering yet another clerical error. The original assessment had miscalculated the amount owed, inflating the debt significantly. Armed with evidence, they contacted the county assessor's office and requested a reassessment. Within hours, the corrected figures were sent back, reducing the woman's debt to a manageable level. When they delivered the news to her later that day, tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, clutching her young son's hand tightly. "I thought we were going to lose everything." Reynolds smiled warmly. "Just doing our job, ma'am. We're glad we could help." As they walked away from her house, Daniels felt a surge of pride. "You know," he said, glancing at his partner, "this is what I signed up for. Helping people, not tearing them down." "Feels good, doesn't it?" Reynolds replied, nodding. "Like we're actually making a difference." Their newfound sense of purpose wasn't lost on their colleagues either. Word of their efforts spread throughout the department, inspiring others to adopt a more proactive approach. Veterans who had grown jaded over the years found themselves reinvigorated, while newer recruits embraced the idea of serving with compassion and integrity. Even Captain Harris noticed the ripple effect, commending Daniels and Reynolds for sparking such positive change. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter remained unaware of the impact her calm demeanor and wise words had left behind. She continued living quietly, in her modest home, tending to her garden and spending afternoons reading by the window. Occasionally, neighbors would stop by to chat, marveling at her sharp mind and gentle spirit. To them, she was simply Evelyn, a kind soul who always had time to listen and offer advice. But one evening, as she sipped tea on her porch, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to her in neat handwriting. bearing the official seal of the county courthouse. Curious, she opened it and began to read. Inside was a heartfelt note from the current chief judge, thanking her for her role in exposing flaws in the system. The letter went on to explain the reforms implemented as a result of her case and expressed gratitude for her grace and understanding during a challenging situation. Mrs. Carter chuckled softly to herself, shaking her head. "Well, I suppose it's nice to know my old bones still have some fight left in them," she muttered under her breath. Though flattered, she didn't dwell on the praise. Instead, she tucked the letter into a drawer alongside other mementos from her life, photos, awards, and letters from former colleagues. What mattered most to her was knowing that her experience had prompted meaningful action, that 2 young officers had taken her lessons to heart and used them to create change. As she gazed out at the sunset, she reflected on the importance of resilience and patience. Change rarely happened overnight, but every small step forward counted. Back at the station, Daniels and Reynolds often found themselves reminiscing about their visit to Mrs. Carter's home. They spoke about her wisdom, her generosity, and the way she'd handled the entire situation with dignity. Over time, her influence became a touchstone for them, a reminder of why they chose this line of work in the first place. During one particularly grueling shift when tensions ran high and frustrations boiled over, Daniels pulled out the card Mrs. Carter had given him. He reread the quote scribbled on it. "Justice is not blind. It sees clearly when we choose to look." Taking a deep breath, he passed the card to Reynolds, who read it silently before nodding. "We've got this," Reynolds said, his tone resolute. "Let's keep looking." And so they did. Whether responding to calls, reviewing paperwork, or interacting with members of the community, they carried Mrs. Carter's philosophy with them. Every decision they made was guided by the belief that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing people, hearing their stories, and fighting for fairness, even when it was hard. Months turned into years, and the reforms, sparked by Mrs. Carter's case, continued to gain momentum. Other departments across the state took notice, adopting similar measures to prevent administrative errors and protect vulnerable residents. Stories of individuals saved from wrongful evictions began to emerge, each one a testament to the power of accountability and empathy. For Daniels and Reynolds, the experience remained a defining moment in their careers. They rose through the EI ranks, becoming mentors to younger officers and advocates for systemic reform. Whenever new recruits joined the force, they were invited to hear Daniels and Reynolds recount their encounter with Mrs. Carter, the retired judge who taught them the true meaning of justice. "She could have been angry with us," Daniels would say, his voice steady and sincere. "Instead, she chose to teach us. She showed us that it's not enough to follow orders blindly. We have to question, to care, and to act with integrity." And she reminded us, Reynolds would add, that justice isn't something abstract or distant. It's personal. It's about the lives we touch every day. As they finished their story, the room would fall silent, the weight of their words sinking in. For many recruits, it was a lesson they'd carry with them long after leaving the academy. A lesson learned from a remarkable woman who saw clearly when others chose to look away. Years passed, and the story of Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the retired judge who had turned a routine eviction attempt into a lesson on justice, became something of a legend within the police department. Officers who had never met her still heard whispers of her name in training sessions or during late-night conversations over coffee. Her wisdom lingered like an echo, shaping the way new recruits approached their work. Daniels and Reynolds, now seasoned veterans themselves, often found themselves reflecting on how much they had grown since that fateful evening. They were no longer the same officers who had arrived at Mrs. Carter's doorstep with an eviction notice in hand. Their perspective on policing had shifted dramatically. They saw themselves not just as enforcers of laws, but as stewards of fairness and accountability. And it was all because of one extraordinary woman. One crisp autumn morning, Daniels walked into the station to find his partner waiting for him with an unusual expression on his face. "You're not going to believe this," Reynolds said, holding up a piece of paper. "Mrs. Carter passed away last night." Daniels froze, his heart sinking. What? How? Reynolds shook his head. It wasn't anything sudden. It seemed she'd been battling illness for a while. Her family called the station to let us know. Apparently, she mentioned us often in her later years, saying we reminded her of younger versions of herself when she first started out as a lawyer. The news hit them both hard. Though they hadn't seen Mrs. Carter since that evening years ago, she had remained a constant presence in their lives, a guiding light whenever they faced difficult decisions. Now, knowing she was gone felt like losing a mentor, even though she'd never officially held that title. Captain Harris soon called them into his office. He looked unusually somber as he handed them another letter. "This arrived for you two earlier today," he said quietly. "It's from Mrs. Carter." Daniels and Reynolds exchanged stunned glances before opening the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, its elegant cursive unmistakably hers. "Dear Officers Daniels and Reynolds, I hope this letter finds you well. If you're reading this, it means I've moved on to whatever comes next. Before I go, I wanted to thank you not just for correcting the mistake that brought us together, but for listening, for truly seeing me as a person rather than just another address on your list. In my years as a judge, I learned that justice is rarely black and white. It's messy, complicated, and deeply human. You taught me that there are still good people, willing to do the hard work of looking beyond the surface. Keep asking questions, keep challenging the system. Most importantly, keep caring, for every individual matters more than any rule ever could. With gratitude, Evelyn Carter." By the time they finished reading, both men had tears in their eyes. The letter was vintage Mrs. Carter. Thoughtful, wise, and filled with quiet encouragement. She had known exactly what to say to remind them of their purpose, to inspire them to keep striving for better. The funeral was held on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon. Despite the gray skies, the church was packed with mourners, family members, friends, former colleagues, and community leaders. As Daniels and Reynolds entered, they noticed framed photographs lining the walls, capturing moments from Mrs. Carter's remarkable life. There she was as a young attorney, standing confidently beside civil rights activists. In another photo, she presided over a courtroom, her expression stern yet compassionate. A third showed her surrounded by students, teaching them about the importance of justice and equality. During the service, several people stood to share memories of Mrs. Carter. One woman recounted how she had mentored her through law school. Another spoke of how she had fought tirelessly for underprivileged communities during her tenure as a judge. But it was her grandson's eulogy that struck Daniels and Reynolds the most. "She always told me that real change happens when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. She believed in the power of kindness, curiosity, and courage, and she lived those values every single day of her life. As they listened, Daniels and Reynolds couldn't help but think about how true those words were. Mrs. Carter had chosen to treat them with kindness despite their blunder. She had sparked their curiosity by sharing her insights, and she had shown incredible courage by turning a potentially humiliating situation into a teachable moment. After the service, her grandson approached them. "Thank you for being here," he said, shaking their hands warmly. "She talked about you too often. She said you reminded her of why she fell in love with the law in the first place." "We should be thanking her," Reynolds replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She changed our lives." In the weeks following Mrs. Carter's death, Daniels and Reynolds decided to honor her legacy in a tangible way. They proposed creating a scholarship fund in her name, aimed at supporting students pursuing careers in law and public service. The idea quickly gained traction, with donations pouring in from across the community. Even Captain Harris threw his full support behind the initiative, helping secure additional funding from city officials. When the scholarship was officially announced, it came with a plaque inscribed with Mrs. Carter's favorite quote, "Justice is not blind. It sees clearly when we choose to look." The plaque was placed prominently in the lobby of the courthouse, ensuring that anyone entering the building would be reminded of her enduring message. As time went on, Daniels and Reynolds continued to carry Mrs. Carter's lessons with them in everything they did. They became vocal advocates for reform, testifying at hearings and speaking at conferences about the importance of empathy and accountability in law enforcement. Their efforts earned them recognition far beyond their small town, but neither man cared much for accolades. What mattered to them was staying true to the values Mrs. Carter had instilled in them. One evening, as they sat together at a diner after a long shift, Daniels broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough?" he asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. Reynolds thought for a moment before answering. "Probably not, but I don't think Mrs. Carter expected perfection from us. She just wanted us to try, to keep pushing for better, even when it feels impossible." Daniels nodded slowly. "Yeah, that sounds about right." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence, watching raindrops streak down the window pane. Outside, the world kept moving, busy, chaotic, imperfect. But inside, they felt grounded, anchored by the memory of a woman who had shown them the path forward. Years later, when Daniels and Reynolds finally retired, they attended a ceremony where the latest recipients of the Evelyn Carter Scholarship were being honored. As they watched young students step onto the stage to accept their awards, they felt a deep sense of pride. Each scholar represented hope, a promise that the fight for justice would continue long after they were gone. Before leaving the event, Daniels stopped to read the plaque once more. Running his fingers over the engraved words, he whispered softly, "Thanks, Mrs. Carter. We're still looking." And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet corners of memory or the vast expanse of eternity, Evelyn Carter smiled. The legacy of Mrs. Evelyn Carter continued to ripple outward long after her passing, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. For Daniels and Reynolds, her influence became a cornerstone of their careers, a guiding principle that shaped not only their actions but also the culture of the department they served. What began as a single moment of grace had grown into a movement, inspiring change far beyond the boundaries of their small town. As the years rolled on, Daniels and Reynolds found themselves increasingly called upon to share their story. They spoke at police academies, community forums, and national conferences, recounting the evening they tried to evict a retired judge and ended up learning one of life's most profound lessons. Their presentations were always met with rapt attention, especially when they shared the quote Mrs. Carter had given them. "Justice is not blind. It sees clearly when we choose to look." At first, neither man felt entirely comfortable in the spotlight. They were just two officers who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation after all. But over time, they came to realize that their story wasn't really about them. It was about Mrs. Carter. It was about the power of compassion, humility, and the willingness to learn from mistakes. And so, they embraced their role as storytellers, hoping to inspire others to carry forward the values she had championed. One particularly memorable event took place at a national law enforcement conference in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of officers, administrators, and policymakers gathered in a grand hall to discuss strategies for improving policing practices. When Daniels and Reynolds stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, save for the soft hum of anticipation. Reynolds began by describing their initial visit to Mrs. Carter's home, the peeling paint, the stacks of books, the framed photographs on the walls. He painted a vivid picture of the elderly woman who had greeted them with calm dignity, despite the circumstances. "We thought we were there to enforce the law," he said, his voice steady. "Instead, we walked away with a deeper understanding of what justice truly means." Daniels picked up where his partner left off, explaining how Mrs. Carter's insights had sparked meaningful reforms within their department. He talked about the new protocols, the training programs, and the scholarship fund named in her honor. But more than anything, he emphasized the importance of empathy. "Mrs. Carter taught us that every case isn't just a file or a number, it's a person," he said, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "And if we don't see those people clearly, then we're failing at our jobs." When they finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People lined up afterward to thank them, many sharing stories of their own encounters with systemic failures and the need for change. One young officer approached them with tears in her eyes. "Your story gives me hope," she said. "It reminds me why I wanted to be a cop in the first place." Back home, the impact of their efforts continued to grow. The Evelyn Carter Scholarship Fund had become a beacon of opportunity for aspiring lawyers and public servants. Each year, dozens of students applied, eager to follow in Mrs. Carter's footsteps. Many recipients went on to pursue careers in advocacy, working tirelessly to address inequities in the legal system. Others returned to their communities as mentors, spreading her message of fairness and integrity. One such recipient was Marcus Johnson, a bright young man from a low-income neighborhood. Growing up, Marcus had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of wrongful evictions and property tax disputes on families like his own. Inspired by Mrs. Carter's story, he dedicated himself to studying law, determined to make a difference. After graduating at the top of his class, he joined a non-profit organization focused on housing rights, providing free legal assistance to those facing similar challenges. Years later, Marcus stood before a packed courtroom arguing a landmark case that would ultimately lead to statewide reforms in property tax assessments. As he delivered his closing statement, he paused briefly, looking directly at the judge. "This fight is for everyone who has ever been overlooked or dismissed because of their zip code, their income, or the color of their skin," he said passionately. "It's for Judge Evelyn Carter, whose wisdom and courage remind us that justice must always begin with seeing clearly." The room erupted in cheers when the verdict was announced, favorable to the plaintiffs. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Marcus, asking him how it felt to win such a significant victory. Smiling modestly, he held up a small card, bearing Mrs. Carter's famous quote. "This is what keeps me going," he told them. "If we choose to look, we can create a better world." Meanwhile, Daniels and Reynolds settled into retirement, though neither man slowed down entirely. They remained active in their community, volunteering at local shelters and mentoring young officers. On weekends, they often visited Mrs. Carter's grave, leaving fresh flowers and sharing updates about the changes they'd helped bring about. "She'd be proud," Daniels would say, brushing a stray leaf from the headstone. "Wouldn't she?" Reynolds always nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. She believed in progress, even when it was slow. And look how far we've come." Their bond with Mrs. Carter's family also deepened over the years. Her grandson, now a successful attorney himself, frequently invited them to family gatherings, treating them like honorary relatives. During one such visit, he presented them with a photo album filled with pictures of Mrs. Carter throughout her life. Flipping through the pages, Daniels and Reynolds marveled at the scope of her achievements, from her early days as a trailblazing lawyer to her later years as a beloved mentor and advocate. "She touched so many lives," Reynolds remarked, his voice tinged with awe, "including ours." Her grandson smiled warmly. "And yours touched hers. She used to say you reminded her of why she loved this work so much. You gave her hope." In the twilight of their lives, Daniels and Reynolds often reflected on the journey they'd taken since that fateful evening. They had started as ordinary officers, simply trying to do their jobs, but through the kindness and wisdom of one remarkable woman, they had discovered a higher purpose, a calling to fight for justice in its truest form. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as they sat together on Reynolds' porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniels broke the silence. "Do you think we made a difference?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. Reynolds considered the question for a moment before answering. "I think we tried. That's what matters, isn't it? We kept looking, kept pushing, kept caring, and maybe, just maybe, we helped make the world a little fairer." Daniels nodded, a contented smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, that sounds about right." As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle overhead, they sat in companionable silence, grateful for the paths they'd traveled and the lessons they'd learned. Somewhere, perhaps in the quiet corners of memory or the vast expanse of eternity, Evelyn Carter smiled once more. Her work was done, but her legacy lived on, in the hearts of those she had inspired and the countless lives they would continue to touch.